We are incredibly excited to start season 2 of the Elmore Leonard podcast with Mr. Michael Connelly. Michael is one of the greats. Like many great novelists, he began his career as a reporter, first in Florida and then for the LA Times. And it was in Los Angeles where he published his first novel. He's written over 40 novels at this point, and most of them are bestsellers. Some of them have been adapted into movies, like Bloodwork, directed by Clint Eastwood, The Lincoln Lawyer, which was a film and is now a television series on Netflix, the Harry Bosch novels, which have spawned 3 different TV shows on Amazon Prime. Like many of our guests, he has won tons of awards, but he is our first guest to have won the Outstanding Contribution to Crime Writing Award at the Teakston's Old Peculiar Crime Writing Festival in Harrogate, England. In addition to novels and television, Michael's also been dipping into the podcast space, which we're going to talk a little bit about today, along with his admiration for Elmore, going from South Florida to Los Angeles, jazz, and so much more. Michael, welcome to the Elmore Leonard podcast. How are you?
I'm good. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you for being on. So I want to start off with your podcast, Killer in the Code, which is really interesting, and I encourage everyone to check it out. I don't want to give too much away, but one thing that I noticed, and I have to ask you about before we get too far into the conversation, is one of the early clues that breaks open this whole story is a code that is 13 letters long. This code contains the name of the murderer. Elmore Leonard is 13 letters long. Did you ever consider that Elmore may have been the murderer?
No, I think he was alibied out
Okay,
early
good.
on.
Good.
Yeah.
We're relieved. But please do tell us a little bit about Killer in the Code. It's very cool.
Yeah, I feel like I'm a member of the media on this, so I'm kind of reporting other people's investigation, but it all started with an eccentric, autistic, um, genius, genius level intellect, a guy who bills himself basically as an amateur sleuth, breaking one of the supposedly unbreakable Zodiac killer codes.
Yeah.
Back in 69, 70, he sent many letters to the media gloating about his kills and threatening others. And 4 of them had ciphers with them and of various lengths. The most tantalizing was called Z13 because it only had 13 letters. And if you know anything about code and cryptology, which I knew nothing of till I got involved in this, but basically the shorter a cipher is, the more difficult it is to break because you won't have repeat letters and things like that as many. Anyway, so he broke what was long considered to be an impossible to break code, and from that, it was also known as the "My Name Is" code, where the Zodiac was so full of his skills as a cryptologist that he said, "This is my name," and so we got a name. I shouldn't say we. This guy's name is Alex Baber. He got a name, and when he did a deep dive into that name, he found out it was an alias for a guy named Marvin Margolis, who was one of the primary suspects in the Black Dahlia murder in Los Angeles 20 years before. So it kind of connects these cases.
It's insane.
And then more ancillary evidence that connects them was procured when Alex went to some professional investigators, former LAPD homicide cops with kind of historic records and notoriety as detectives, and they came in and confirmed a lot what he did. And I happen to know them, so they came to me, and that's how this whole thing started.
Oh,
It's
wow.
all founded. It's all founded on his breaking this code. So I had to go out and find someone unrelated to him and an authority in cryptology to confirm what he did, and I did do that in a big way with probably one of the top cryptologists in the world. And then he turned around and had his work peer reviewed and also confirmed it. But it is, I'm sorry, I keep cutting you off, but you said you did like rambling, so I'm rambling here.
I
But
love rambling. Please keep rambling on.
and this whole thing made us stray into this cultural phenomenon of where people have their own theories on who killed who and all this
Yeah.
stuff. And so we're getting pot shotted right and left, but I stand by my reporting on this, and I stand by the investigation. And it is, to start with what you said, it's pretty amazing that these cases are connected, and the evidence is very solid.
So you get a call from one of your LA homicide detectives saying, "Michael, you're not going to believe this. Guess what?" Because in the podcast, we don't hear too much of that. I'm just sort of curious about that because I like.
Yeah, it's more or less what you just said. One of these detectives is Rick Jackson. He spent 36 years with the LAPD, and most of it, I think, 24 of them in homicide. And now he's a volunteer homicide cold case investigator for a county in Northern California, still solving murders. I think he's about 72 or 74.
Oh wow.
Anyway, he called me and said, I'm involved in what is something that is very amazing. We want to keep it close to the vest. So I first had to sign a non disclosure agreement before I got to hear what this was about. But I've known Rick for 25 years. He's helped me with my books. He's a very storied detective from the LAPD, even going back almost 40 years when I covered crime in Los Angeles for the LA Times.
Yeah.
I knew of him, and I wrote about cases that he investigated and solved. So when he said this is worth your time, and this is amazing, and he also said I'm totally on board. I believe it's true. I quickly signed the NDA and got the presentation. And Rick did the same thing with his former partner named Mitzi Roberts, who ran the cold case squad at the LAPD until she retired last year. And as the supervisor of that, she was in charge of the Black Dahlia case,
Hmm.
and she had been in cold case, the unit, going on something like 10 years, and no, 15 years. I'm sorry, 15 years. And so she, over those 15 years, became quite conversant with the Black Dahlia case, because it's all the records are in a four drawer file cabinet.
Hmm.
And she methodically went through them during her years of being in charge of that case. So Rick Jackson went to her with this, because there's probably no more knowledgeable expert on that case in the world right now,
Yeah.
that's still alive. And she became quickly a subscriber, a believer,
Hmm.
um, that these cases can now be attributed to this one man, Marvin Margolis.
It reminds me a lot of the original documentary series of The Staircase, which I don't know if you ever watched that.
Yeah, I did.
Um, and where every episode there's just kind of something amazing that happens and it keeps sort of pulling you forward. And I can't wait to hear the rest of it. I wanted to ask you something. I think that I saw you many years ago at the last bookstore for an event for Mark Frost's Twin Peaks: The Secret History book, and which sort of preceded the relaunch of Twin Peaks. I think it was 6 or 7 years ago, and I thought it was so cool that you've probably done all the book signings and readings that you could ever want to, and you're showing up for somebody else. And was that you, or am I completely imagining that?
No, yeah, it was me. I was there with my daughter, and the first Twin Peaks was a major father daughter sharing thing.
Really?
I watched it when it came out. And then when my daughter was getting into TV, and she went to film school, um, big David Lynch fan,
Sure.
and so I said we have to watch that together. And I think it was her who said, "Dad, Mark has a book coming out about Twin Peaks, and I want to go. Do you want to go with me?" And so I did. And
Yeah.
and it was what was cool was when I got my book signed by Mark. He was familiar with Harry Bosch, and so it was like, oh my gosh, the guy who worked with Lynch in creating that show, was familiar with my work. So it was a pretty heady experience for me.
I loved that book, and the way that they wrapped up that show was it was pretty wild. I mean, it was very different than the original one. It was sort of like
Yeah.
pure Lynch. And there's a couple episodes that the one where they with the Abe Lincoln woodsman, who and it's all about like I think it was like the seventh or eighth episode with the nuclear explosions going off, and That was some of the most amazing stuff I'd ever seen. TV, movie, whatever you want. I mean, they really did
Yeah.
something unique there. Because you're doing so much television now, have you ever thought about doing something like that, where you write a book that sets up a TV series but doesn't actually tell the story that we see on the TV show?
Not really. Right now, my life is pretty complicated, and all I'm about is trying to get away from everything to get into a room by myself and just write my books. And that's really all consuming.
Yeah.
And so that's what I think about. I do have a lot of stuff going on. I mean, I'm working with another writer on a graphic novel
Oh, cool.
that springs from one of my Harry Bosch stories, but follows a different character that Harry Bosch has mentored. And that's been fun and quite different. So I'm always trying
Yeah.
something new. I think going into, like, 3 months ago, I had no plans to do a podcast, but when a story like this comes to you and you have it basically exclusively, you got to do it. You got to
Yeah.
put stuff aside to do it.
Do you feel like you're more of a reporter on this, or a novelist, or how? Like, what muscles are you flexing with this, from your standpoint?
Definitely journalistic. I'm trying to be as far away from it as a novelist as I can be because it's strange. It's an amazingly strange story, and I don't want people to start thinking this is fiction.
Yeah.
In fact, that's probably a handicap here because some of the naysayers who are protecting their own investment in other suspects, they're quick to say I'm providing fiction here, or they're quick to say I should go back to writing fiction. So I wish I didn't carry that baggage in this, and I wish I was viewed as a straight journalist. And that's what I'm trying to be. And I'm mostly reporting the work of others, but I've gotten involved in ways of confirming some of the work. Like I said, I found the only guy in the history of the National Security Agency to be both their chief code breaker and code maker. So
Yeah.
there's no higher authority than that to
Right.
work on this, and that's what a journalist would do. A journalist would be out there trying to confirm the facts that others have provided you, and that's my role in this, as well as reporting it in terms of a podcast.
It is tremendous. And at the very least, because it happened so long ago, some of these things are impossible to prove. But that doesn't mean that they're not worth discussing and talking about. So I do have a couple questions about Elmore. This is the Elmore Leonard podcast. And we don't need to only talk about Elmore, but where I typically start, we didn't today, but where I typically start the conversation is by asking, what was the Elmore Leonard novel that made you realize, that made you want to read more? Maybe not the first Elmore book you read, but the one that said, all right, I got to read more of this guy.
I mean, it's both. It's La Brava. At the time I read that, it's set in South Florida,
Yeah.
mostly Miami, and I was working as a journalist. I was covering crime in South Florida at that time,
Oh, wow.
and I can't remember, like, did I see a review or whatnot. But I picked up that book, and it still remains my favorite book. I mean, I get that myself. People usually, when you discover an author, that become whatever book that is,
Yeah.
seems to become your favorite book, and maybe that's because of sentimentality, but also I think it's one of his most accomplished books. And from there I started going backwards and forward. I read it in hardback, so I read it the year it came out. I think I read it. I know it won an Edgar for best novel, but I think I read it before that.
It's a special book. Elmore is, often thought of as a writer, from Detroit, tells stories about Detroit, but he's written, I think, almost as many books set in Florida as Detroit. You were working in Florida as a crime journalist. You're covering crime in Florida. What is it about Florida that is so unique and so different from the rest of the country?
I think it's a destination place.
Yeah.
Very few people. My wife was born there, but I don't know very many other people that were born there. And I moved there when I was 12. It has a whole influx of the Cuban migration. It's just a kind of a melting pot that doesn't melt that well. Um,
Hmm.
and that creates some friction, and friction in societal friction is perfect for crime fiction.
Yeah.
And you can use the crime fiction as a framework to take a look at something going on in the culture, and a lot of cultural change and a lot of mixed culture in South Florida. And I really say South Florida because that seems to be where many great writers plant their flag.
But you've been in LA for 40 some years at this point. I mean, like most of your.
Yeah, almost. And I came here in '87.
And you went out to LA to work for LA Times. And then that's LA is where you wrote your first novel. Was there something about being in LA that.
I mean, it's where I wrote my first published novel, but I wrote two Florida-based novels when I was there, set in Fort Lauderdale,
Oh, okay.
and they just weren't good enough because this is at a period where I'm reading like Elmore Leonard and other Ross McDonald. I grew up working at the Bahia Mar Hotel and Resort, which is where the Busted Flush of John D. McDonald's books was docked.
Huh.
And several people that I worked for, I'm talking about being a dishwasher and stuff like that
Yeah.
when I was in high school, were characters in John D. McDonald's books.
Oh, wow.
He used real people, which I do now, and I got it from him.
Yeah.
But yeah, I was very steeped in Florida crime fiction and was trying to do it on my own. I had written a story. I worked for the Fort Lauderdale News, and Sun Sentinel. The news is gone, but the Sun Sentinel is still there. But I'd written a story about this private eye. At that time, Fort Lauderdale was known as the runaway capital of the world, and he would advertise in northern newspapers and magazines that he could find your runaway daughter or your
Hmm.
runaway son down in South Florida.
Yeah.
And he had a whole business, and all he did was look for 16-year-old kids who had run away or stayed at spring break and never went home.
Oh, my God.
And I wrote a couple novels about that type of private eye, and they just weren't. The first one was not worthy of being published, and neither was the second. But the second one was better.
Okay.
Every writer you talk to, Elmore included, are always our own harshest critic. And so they weren't good enough. And I was approaching my 30th birthday and thought, my wife had said, let's put off creating a family and let you try to achieve this dream you have of being a novelist, a crime novelist. And I just kind of felt like if I got one more swing at this, and before I take it, I should probably shake things up in my life. I was writing about my hometown, what I considered my hometown. I moved there when I was 12, and I just thought I should try something new. So I started sending out resumes around the country, and basically whoever hired me, I mean, whoever wanted me, I was going to go there and write a crime novel. And I just luckily, the first offer I got was from LA Times.
Oh, wow.
And so I came out to LA to cover crime for the newspaper, and kind of went from there.
Did you have the story in mind before you started working for the paper, while you were still in Florida, or was it something that totally came to you while living in LA?
I had the character in mind, but not the story. And through the course of this interview, you're going to hear me say I was so lucky. A lot of luck happened to me along the path, and the story came to me on my first day on the job. I started on the Tuesday after Labor Day weekend in 1987, and over that 3-day period, these guys had tunneled underneath a bank and then up into the safe deposit vault and spent 3 days popping open safe deposit boxes and stealing their contents.
Oh,
And
my
so it was
God.
a big story. It wasn't, I was a rookie, I was a new guy, but I was on the cop beat. And so it wasn't my story, but it happened. And it was front page story, the day I started.
Yeah.
And eventually, a few months later, I was allowed to kind of sneak into a briefing among detectives where the detectives on that bank vault caper were telling other detectives because they thought this was only the first one. There's going to be more, and this is what you got to look for, and so forth. So I got a slideshow about that uh, case. Photos of the tunnel, photos of the equipment they left behind, the
How
the
did you
vault.
sneak into the?
I had a source, a lieutenant that was in charge of detectives in this. It was LAPD has like a headquarters, but back then they also had 18 divisions, geographic divisions, and each one had a detective bureau. Very small, but they had a detective bureau. And the guys handling this robbery were going around to all these 18 divisions and giving this show.
Hmm.
They didn't have it back then, but essentially a PowerPoint show on this robbery so people would be aware and so forth. Because the tunneling took weeks. It was a long,
Yeah.
thought out deal. And then they found another tunnel that was in process, but it was going under a main street. And they had this moral decision: do we wait to them and be waiting in the vault when they break in over the next 3-day weekend? Or do we risk that this tunnel is unstable and it might collapse a major street and cause people to crash and possibly die and so forth? So they decided to do the right thing and fill that tunnel in,
Yeah.
and they missed their chance of catching these guys, and they ended up never catching them. But I knew all this, and it was like I have to mount this into a story. But to go back to your question, I got very close to the guy, the sergeant who was in charge of the homicide squad in Fort Lauderdale. So it was him and 6 detectives, and that was the unit. And I did a magazine story on them. Spent a lot of time with them on cases. Got fully integrated. Where I had a pager. This was before cell phones. If they got a call,
Hmm.
my pager would go off, and I was there watching their investigations. And the guy in charge was a Vietnam vet. He was very dedicated. He was very detail oriented, and he had all these things that you will later see in Harry Bosch. And his name was George Hurt. And so I left Florida, but I had the character of George Hurt in my head, and then I wed it to this tunnel robbery that landed in my lap my first day on the job.
That was Black Echo.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. That's awesome. I lived in LA for 23 years, and one of the things that I really do love about your books is you get a feeling of LA that is not that I feel is like the real LA, where there's a side of Los Angeles that's very industrial, and there's a lot of variety. There's a lot of, I think it's more of a working class city than what it's perceived to be. And I always think that like that comes through in your books and your book set in LA. Is there something about LA? I'll ask you the same question that I asked about Florida. Is there something about LA that people who don't live there just will never understand?
I mean, it's very similar answer to South Florida. It's a destination place.
Yeah.
But I really like what you have mentioned there about it being more industrial. People just think it's the dream factory. It's always called that. And it's actually not even. I mean, probably corporately, it's the center of our entertainment industry for this country, maybe even the world. But it's now so spread out. There's very little production anymore in Los Angeles.
Yeah.
Often I feel like I'm the one keeping it alive because by the end of this month I'll have 3 shows in production out here, but I heard there was only 5. And so it's certainly changed just in the time that I've lived here. But probably, which I didn't like when it happened, but I now value very much, is that I got sent to, I got hired by the LA Times. Back then, it was the highest circulation paper in the country. It was enormously successful and always expanding. And I got hired as part of this expansion where the Valley would have its own edition. And the
Oh,
Valley is not Hollywood. I mean, I don't know where you live, but when you say LA is more industrial than
yeah.
most people realize, you're talking about the Valley.
Yeah.
And and Valley doesn't normally have like the amazing crimes that capture public attention. It's just a working class city. And I covered crime there for like 7 years. And, and it's big. It's got almost 3 million people, and it's a bowl with mountains all around it. Smog gets caught in it. And it's just not what you think of when people think about LA. And that's where I basically cut my teeth. And that's why a lot of my stories end up in the valley. Because when you come to a town as a reporter, you become a very quick study of that town because you're going out every day. And I was going out on crime. So I was going into neighborhoods that most people in LA have never even been to. But I was the new guy, and I didn't even get to LA till I was 30 years old. And so it's just an interesting culture that hopefully I do capture in my books, and it's a part of the overall LA culture that most people don't know about.
Yeah. Speaking of tangents, do you have a preference, Philippe's or Cole's?
Yeah, Felice, but I don't know if you know this, but Kohl's closed about a month ago.
I do know that. My
Yeah.
good friend used to play the piano in the varnish room.
Okay.
And yeah, I prefer Philippe's too, but they don't have a full bar. So it's.
What's interesting is that we filmed our shows in Cole. Both
Yeah.
Lincoln Lawyers filmed there and the Boss Show. And we always hear from Philippe saying, like, why don't you want to film here? And we say we do, but every time we ask to film there, you guys say no.
Oh, really?
So it's like there's somebody in there wants us to film and somebody in there doesn't want us to film. So we've never captured that in any of the TV shows, but we've been in Cole's a few times.
You're a professional novelist, so you tell me if you think this would have been a good book. It had to be set in the 90s, and it was basically about set in LA in the 90s about who really, because both Coles and Philippe's claim to have invented the French dip sandwich, which I think
Right.
is ridiculous. So, who really invented the French dip sandwich, Coles or Philippe's, set against the backdrop of bringing an NFL team to LA? Because at the time, there wasn't an NFL team. Would that have made a good book?
Yeah, if somebody gets murdered, if the debate leads to murder.
Okay, fair enough.
Yeah, I forget which we actually get into that debate in one of the TV shows. I think it's a Lincoln Lawyer and someone he's a Philippe's guy and someone else is a Cole's guy. I can't remember exactly how it turned out.
It's so good. I want to talk about music. Both you and Elmore use music in your books. I love it, but it has to be done the right way, or I think it can, it can just take over. So, how do you use it? When do you use it? Do you have rules about using music in your
Well, I
books?
use it sparingly because it's a weird thing. I do a printed story, so if I
Yeah,
talk about music, the reader, sometimes even the listener on audio, can't hear it.
sure.
But it is, for me, the most important thing about it is revealing character. Obviously, what you listen to says something about, your era, who you are, and so forth. I primarily use it in with Harry Bosch,
Mm,
and I just decided early on that he would find solace in jazz music,
yeah.
and more particularly in with saxophone. I think it was in a Walter Mosley book, an Easy Rawlins book, where he describes saxophone as the sound of a saxophone as a baby crying, and I just thought that was
Hmm.
magnificent description. And I've kind of been trying to reach that ever since because it's so hard to write about music. It's the hardest thing I do, but I also feel it's important, to a character to know what they're listening to. So much important that when I don't give a character a musical character stroke, I'm remiss. I started a new character last year, this detective who works out on the island of Catalina, and I didn't give him any music. And I have another book coming out with him in May, and he's got music this time because I messed up. I forgot to add that, or I didn't have time. I can't remember why there's no music in that book, but he definitely has music in it
Yeah.
now. And I just, and it's interesting because again, people are not hearing what you're talking about. They'll have to like put the book down and go to Spotify or wherever they get their music to hear it. But in like my last book, which was a Mickey Haller book, he talks about the opening chord of a Santana song
Uh-huh.
as being like something that goes right through your chest, and equating it to like the gotcha moment in a trial.
Hmm.
So there's ways music can be helpful in delivering character, but it's one of these mysteries of the which makes the experience of reading and imagination so magnificent, that you can talk about music in a printed story, and it can still kind of transcend things and say something about your character.
I think it's great. I mean, I typically won't stop, reading something to go if I don't know the music, but when it's something I know or I'm familiar with, it's fantastic. It just brings so much more to it, and it is a
Yeah, it's interesting. I wrote the first Harry Bosch book, Black Echo, in an apartment building in Sherman Oaks.
okay.
This is when I was working at the LA Times, and I was one. It was a two-story apartment building. I mean, we were townhouses, and next door to us was another one. The valley's full of these. Another two-story apartment building, and then on the other side of that was the 101 freeway,
Hmm.
and it was and it's elevated there, and so the overpass was right on our street on Kester,
Hmm.
and so the sound of the freeway was constant at our place, and I was writing at night because I have my day job at the LA Times. This It's not as steady at night, the sound of traffic. So when it's steady during day, you can kind of blank it out.
Mm-hmm.
But at night, it's more sporadic, and I'm talking about late at night. I'm writing like around midnight and later, when I would finally be able to get some time to write on my book. And so I started listening to jazz. I decided to start. I wanted music to kind of drown out or to camouflage the freeway,
Yeah.
and I didn't want to have words because that could be distracting while I'm trying to write words. So I went to jazz. Jazz was not the music I grew up with. It was my dad's. There was jazz in our house.
Uh huh.
But you have to reject your parents on some levels. And so I went down the road of rock and roll and blues, Eric Clapton, that kind of stuff. And so I got a lot of the stuff that I'd heard that in my house, that my dad liked, and I started playing it while I was writing, and then it by osmosis goes into Harry Bosch.
Did you steal those records from your dad, or did you go out and get them on your own?
No, I got stuff on my own,
Oh,
and
okay.
probably back then it was cassette tapes.
What was your wife doing? Like you bring her out to L.A. and then you're staying up late at night listening to jazz. That's a lot to ask.
Yeah, no,
Uh,
it was. I mean, we made this deal. I mean, she knew before we got married. I mean, I met her in college, and so she knew what my ultimate plan was. Like, I didn't say I wanted to be a career journalist. I said I want to get on cop beats and courtrooms as kind of like a long-term research. But eventually, I want to write these books, and whatever your job is, the more you do it, the better you get at it. So I said, I got to be writing now. I don't have any prospects of being published, but I have to do this, and it's something in me that I'm going to do whether I ever get published or not. And so she subscribed. I did say, basically, I asked when we got to LA. It was more of a I'm taking my last swing at this,
yeah.
and if it doesn't work, I'm going to be a career crime journalist, and that's a pretty fascinating job. So it wasn't like, oh my god, I have to do that. It was like I'm in a win-win situation here. I have a pretty interesting job. I'm working in one of the biggest cities of the world, where the police are both vilified and innovative.
Yeah.
It's a perfect place to be a cop reporter, but I don't want to be a cop reporter. I want to be a novelist. But if I have to settle to be a cop reporter, that will be fine. But I need a couple years to take one more swing at this. And what I would like is one weekend day and 4 nights a week after work,
Hmm.
after dinner, that I disappear. And we had a big walk-in closet in a guest bedroom that I moved in there so I'd have no distractions, no windows.
Huh.
Could try to buffer the sound of the freeway, and I that lasted about 2.5 years before I sold a book.
What was the book that made you want to be a novelist?
Probably The Little Sister. I shouldn't say probably. I mean, it was Raymond Chandler. So I saw the movie with Elliot Gould, The Long Goodbye,
Yeah.
and I had not read, even though I was voraciously reading crime fiction. I was really looking at contemporary crime fiction and in the '70s, and Chandler, had not published. He was dead, and his books were in the '30s, '40s, '50s. So I had skipped him, but I saw this movie, which was a very contemporary take on The Long Goodbye,
Hmm.
and that made me start reading Chandler's books and his book Little Sister. Something about his descriptions of L.A., and I'd never even been to L.A., but something about that really hooked me. Uh, Kind of it elevated things. It was like not about the puzzle; it was about the place
Yeah.
and the character, and that was the one that did it.
That's fantastic. Have you ever thought about, with all the work you're doing now in television, have you ever thought about adapting some of Chandler's work for TV?
In a little bit way, it was in that movie. He was played by Elliot Gould, and Elliot Gould is on my show Lincoln Lawyer, and so we have
That's right.
conspired to write a sequel to that book. I mean that movie that would include Harry Bosch. So it would be Elliot Gould reprising his role as an old man. Elliot's in his 80s,
Oh, wow.
and then Bosch would follow a case as a private detective that comes to him, and we wrote a treatment on it. The stars are aligned because the rights to a sequel rights to that movie are owned by MGM, which is owned by Amazon. Amazon has control of the Bosch character, so all these things could work together.
Wow.
And we're just in a stage where we'll present this soon and see what happens.
Oh my God, that sounds amazing. I hope we get to see that. You like writing, I don't want to call them a series of books, but you like to write more than one book about characters that you love, whether it's Bosch or Jack McAvoy. I still have the occasional nightmare from The Poet, by the way. That is a scary, scary book. But when do you figure out, how many books had you written about Bosch before you thought you really figured him out? Was it the first book or was it a few books in?
No, it was definitely a few books in. I don't even know if I've figured them out now, but the I threw you throw everything into your first book because you just want to get it published. And I was definitely inspired by James Ellroy's life. His mother was murdered, and now he writes murder stories. I took that to create this character whose mother was murdered, and now he solves murders, and most of the time, particularly about women who were murdered. And so the psychology is pretty clear. And when I got a deal for my first book, I I told them, or maybe they asked me, like, what would you do next if this book does well or is published well? I said, yeah, I'd solve his mother's murder. And my editor said, no, you don't do that fast. You gotta, that's several books down the road. And that was really good advice. And so it was my fourth book called Last Coyote, and that also happened to be the book I wrote as a full time novelist. I was able to leave my job to write that,
Oh, wow.
and so that's where I really felt I came into my own as a writer, as a book writer, and it's where I really got into the heart of the matter about Harry Bosch. So I'd probably pick that book. And like I said, that was when I was transitioning to being a full time writer. I didn't know how long it would last. I had gotten in advance that my wife and I figured out we had a 3 year shot at making it or not, and then I would go back to being a journalist, and she would go back to being in business.
Mm.
But we didn't have to. It turned out well. And that was the book that was followed with The Poet, which you just mentioned, which is about a journalist. So it was kind of like my way of saying goodbye to that business, is to write about, basically what I did for the 15 years leading up to that.
Does James Elroy know this?
Yeah,
He
it's
is.
funny. Here's a rambling anecdotal story. So James Ellroy and I had the same Hollywood agent,
Mm.
and so we had met each other through that. And I wrote this book called The Last Coyote, where Harry Bosch solves his murder. And then there was this big announcement that Ellroy was writing a nonfiction book about trying to solve his mom's murder. And at that time, he was living in Kansas City. This was like 94 or something. So it wasn't like I could email him. I don't even know if he has email to this day. But
Yeah.
so I sent him a letter and got his address through our mutual agent. And I sent him a letter saying, like, this is a coincidence. I have a book coming, a fiction coming out about Harry Bosch solving his murder. You have nonfiction coming out. And, I hope this doesn't cause you any trouble. I didn't know you were doing that.
Yeah.
Basically, it was a letter of apology, and I hope this is all right.
Uh huh.
And so I happened, even though I was now a full time writer, I kept my writing period, my writing schedule, and so I was writing in the middle of the night because that's how I wrote my first three books essentially. And I haven't done that in a long time, but at that time I was just still transitioning into being a full time writer, so I was keeping the same schedule. So one day I'm in my writing office. Now I have an office, not a walk in closet. I actually have an office with a nice view of the city. And my phone rings, and it's like, I don't know what it is. It's like 5 in the morning, which I guess makes it 7 or 8 in Kansas City. But I answer the phone, and it's James Ellroy, and he goes like, "I got your letter," and probably he was probably playing with me for dramatic purposes. Then there's silence, and I go, "Okay." And I didn't know whether he'd say cancel that book or whatever, but which was too late to have happen, so I
Yeah.
didn't know what was going to happen. And he said, "Unfortunately, I don't have the franchise on murdered mothers. So good luck with your book." And that's an exact quote. That's an exact quote.
That is pretty
Yeah.
perfect. Are you guys buddies? You guys hang out?
Not really, because he's not in LA. We've done stuff together. One of my, I've got to do a lot of really cool and interesting things. But he got the kind of lifetime achievement award from the LA Times Book Awards maybe 3, 4 years ago. And so the next day at the LA Times Book Festival, I got to be the guy who interviewed him. That was the last time I saw him.
Oh, nice.
Um, yeah, I did a. It's funny. I spent a lot of time with him once working on a magazine story about him because he is a public persona, and then he has his real persona, and
Yeah.
I wanted to get to that, and I did write a story, and then the magazine killed it because they got beat by a competitor who published a very short story, nothing like what I had written,
Huh.
but it was like these two tabloid weeklies
Yeah.
that were out in LA when you were here. It was what do you
LA
call it?
Weekly.
LA Weekly, and I forget what the other one was called. But the other one was called was run by a former editor of mine from the LA Times, and he's the one who came to me and said, "You know James Ellroy, let's do a story about the real James Ellroy, not the guy who does all these crazy things at book signings."
Yeah.
And so I did that, and then the LA Weekly came out with a story that wasn't it wasn't a profile. It was more like about his new book and so forth. And for some reason, my old pal, my old editor, killed my story.
Put it on your website.
You know what? This was like so long ago. I don't know where that is.
I always like asking this of people who had been reporters before becoming novelists. What was the main thing you learned as a writer from being a reporter?
I think it's going to be two things. One is the work ethic. Um, I worked for papers. I got out of that business in '94, so it was still a very profitable business. When LA Times would send me on a story, they'd fly me first class. Those days are long gone. But the work ethic, because they were successful, they would put out multiple editions a day. Like I mentioned Fort Lauderdale. The morning paper was called the Sun Sentinel. The afternoon paper was the Fort Lauderdale News. And I would write for both. And
Hmm.
I had to, and some days I'd have to write like the same story 6 times and make it different 6 times. And sometimes you had updated information that was perfect, but sometimes you had nothing new and you had to like just take it from another angle and make it feel fresh. And that gave me a work ethic So most writers like me get questions like, what do you do about writer's block? I don't know what that is. I don't have writer's block. I've never had it. Because in the newspaper business, you can't say, man, to your boss, man, I don't have it today.
I got
I'll
nothing.
be back tomorrow. That kind of thing. You can't do that. And so it gave me a work ethic. And I write every day. And I'm not saying I write all day. Sometimes it's very short periods, but I write every day. And that's why I've published 41 books. But on a more like interior, it gave me an ear for dialogue, and this is where I connect to Elmore Leonard. I mean, that's the man. He's the master, and I learned that from him. But I also learned it from the practice of journalism because my era of journalism was print. It wasn't, on these online newspapers now. You can write as long as you want.
Yeah.
Not true when I was a journalist, and you would, especially with crime, you'd be given a hole. They call it. Your hole is 6 inches.
Hmm.
You got to write a story in 6 inches, and you got always have more information than you have room for. And so you really kind of learn to listen for dialogue that carries information and that can move a story forward. No fluff in dialogue in a newspaper back in that era. Everything was was to carry new information, and you develop an ear for it, and that can take you further into the nuances of language and things like that are not that important in a newspaper story, but are important in a novel.
Hmm.
And so I don't get anywhere near the kind of credit I get for that Elmore Leonard gets for his dialogue, but I do get credit for it, and I think it comes from my newspaper days.
That's fantastic. Michael, just a few more questions before we wrap
I
up.
didn't get a chance to tell my Elmore Leonard story.
Well, don't let me stop you.
So I'm in Fort Lauderdale at the newspaper,
Yeah.
and they're filming, actually walking distance from the newspaper. They were filming the movie Stick, and this is how naive I am. That I mean, even though that was set in Miami, they filmed a lot in Fort Lauderdale. In fact, the bar Dirty Nelly's. I grew up walking distance from Dirty Nelly's. I've been there dozens of times, and one of the opening scenes is there. And anyway, they were filming at a fancy house in what is called the Los Olas Isles
All right.
of Fort Lauderdale. And I was this was soon after I'd read La Brava and then started digging into everything I could find by Elmore Leonard. And I was so naive. I thought Elmore Leonard's there. They're filming there, so he's got to be there. So I used my press pass to get past the initial guards or security, set security, and was kind of walking around the outskirts of this set looking for Elmore Leonard. And I'd seen this picture on the back of a book. That's what I had basically. And finally, someone said, "Who are you?" And I showed my press pass, and I said, "I'm here to see Elmore Leonard." And if I actually saw him, I don't even know what I'd say other than like, I want to be I want to do what you're doing, and I think I'm on my way to it. And I appreciate your writing. La Brava really means something to me. I don't know what I would have said, but I was just looking for him, and then they, of course, escorted me out. And somebody said somebody said, "Who's Elmore Leonard?" And I said, he's the guy who wrote this movie and wrote the book. And he goes, "The writers are never here," and that's was when I learned that Hollywood doesn't really appreciate the writer. And then
Well,
it would be years. Actually, it would be years before I actually met him. I met him when he gave me an Edgar. He was president of Mystery Writers of America when I won an Edgar for best first novel, and
oh
he
my
was the guy
gosh.
who shook my hand and handed it to me.
Did you get a chance to apologize for not running up to Burt Reynolds and convincing him to not ruin this great book, Stick?
Yeah, well, the book is the book is still the book. The movie wasn't that good. I
Yeah.
mean, I've had that experience, but you always have the book to fall back on, and that's one of his better books, in my opinion.
Oh, for sure.
Um, and I remember I went on a nostalgic journey at one point to I've watched Stick within the last 5 years. Yeah.
Oh, really?
Maybe I was longing for my hometown of Fort Lauderdale and Dirty Nellies or something, but yeah.
Well, we will always have Dirty Nellies. Michael, thank you so much for joining us. This has been a real thrill. We really appreciate you taking the time.
Thanks for having me.
The Elmore Leonard podcast is produced and edited by Judd Rubin. Music by Greg Ahee. Hosted by Judd Rubin and Alex Leonard. Executive produced by Peter Leonard. Copyright 2025, Elmore Leonard Inc. Please visit us at elmoreleonardofficial.com or send us an email at hello@theelmoreleonardpodcast.com.